This is the Warfare Mastery Institute, and today we're asking the question, how decisive was the Battle of Midway? Now, this is an interesting question and also an important question for military professionals and scholars, and we'll discuss why at the end. But to start out with, there's an argument to be made that the Battle of Midway was not as decisive as people believe that it was. And the argument goes something like this. So if we look at the balance of forces, the balance of carrier forces prior to Midway, we can see that the Japanese have 14 carriers and the United States has 5 carriers. Now, among those, 7 of the Japanese carriers are fleet carriers, and all 5 of the American carriers are fleet carriers. Now, once the battle starts, we're going to click on Midway here. We can see that the Americans win a decisive tactical victory and destroy 4 Japanese carriers, losing only 1 of their own. So then if we move directly after the Battle of Midway, we can see that the balance changes from 14-5 or 7-5 to 10-4 or 3-4. So in fleet carriers, the United States now outnumbers the Japanese. So this is a pretty significant change in the balance of forces. However, if we drag the timeline all the way to the right, we can see that by the war's end, the Japanese have 5 carriers and the United States has 79. And the critical number there is the 79, which reflects the industrial capacity of the United States to build 79 carriers. Now, as you can see, most of those are escort carriers and light carriers, and there are some relevant points to discuss there. But even just looking at the fleet carriers, 16 fleet carriers is a pretty significant change from the realm of 4, 5, 6, 7 that we were dealing with at the beginning of the war. So the question is, how decisive could it have really been to destroy 4 carriers in a battle when we're looking at a total of 79 carriers that end up in the Pacific by the end of the war? And also note that the number 79 there is not even the total number of carriers that were built by the United States, only those that were sent to the Pacific theater. So the argument is that there was really nothing that the Japanese could do to change what would eventually happen. Whoever won the Battle of Midway, this construction and deployment of 79 carriers to the Pacific was still going to happen. The Japanese were not probably going to invade the United States, capture all the factories, and shut down the industrial capacity. However, there are other factors involved here that we haven't discussed yet. So certainly by the end of the war, the United States had achieved a serious superiority in industry. However, if we go back to the period directly after the Battle of Midway, we see that in the first month after the battle, the calculus has not changed much. The second month, still relatively even. And then in September of 1942, the USS Wasp is sunk by a Japanese submarine. So the United States is now down to 3 carriers. If we continue to move forward in the Solomons campaign to the Battle of Santa Cruz, the Hornet is then sunk. So at this point, by the beginning of November 1942, the Japanese have 4 fleet carriers and the United States are down to 2 fleet carriers. If we consider what might have happened if the Japanese had won the Battle of Midway, halfway through the Guadalcanal campaign, the United States might have no carriers at all. How might that have affected the battles on Guadalcanal and the overall outcome of the campaign? Now, if we continue moving forward, we see 1 month, 2 months. By 3 months, the United States has started to build escort carriers, but the fleet carrier balance is still in the Japanese favor. Now, it's not until May of 1943 that the Essex arrives in theater. So at this point, the balance starts to shift. However, from the Battle of Santa Cruz to when the Essex arrives, that's over 6 months, and almost a year from the Battle of Midway. So there's a whole year period in here when the carrier force balance is either relatively even or in the Japanese favor. Now at this point, from here on, we can see this is where the United States really starts to pull into the lead. So possibly by around May of 1943, around the time that the Essex carrier started coming out, at that point maybe it was too late for the Japanese. However, we have a whole year period in here. If the Battle of Midway is decisive, it's because it could have allowed the Japanese to do something in that interval between the Battle of Midway and the arrival of the Essex-class carriers in 1943. During that period, the conflict was still relatively up for grabs. Now, if we recall, Admiral Yamamoto had originally estimated that he could press an effective offensive for 6 months. If we start at Pearl Harbor and go for 6 months, that essentially puts us about at the Battle of Midway. However, based on what we've just seen, Yamamoto could have potentially run wild for significantly longer. So during this period where the carrier balance was relatively even, what could have happened? Ultimately, while the Japanese were on the offensive, they were not fighting an offensive war from a strategic perspective. Their goal was not to invade the United States and capture it. Their goal was to prevent the United States from interfering with their regional expansion efforts. So why were they on the offensive? A good reason for them to be on the offensive would be to fight forward to a more defensible position. So to bring in a classical analogy, in the Battle of Thermopylae, the Spartans had an advantage because they were defending a narrow pass. However, put yourself in the Spartans' position and think about what would happen if you find yourself ahead of the ideal defensive terrain when the enemy attack comes. In that situation, you might want to give ground. You might want to fall back to the best defensive position. Now, what if the best defensive terrain lay ahead of you? In that case, you might need to fight forward to occupy that terrain in order to be able to sustain the defense. You're advancing not to take the offensive, but rather to advance to a position where you can defend more effectively. So the question is, what might that have looked like for the Japanese? Could they have captured Port Moresby in New Guinea and the Solomons in order to cut off the supply lines to Australia? What would have been a good stopping point for the Japanese offensive that would have allowed them to transition to a defense and hold off the United States? Now, this is just a very brief coverage of this issue, and we mostly just want to pose the initial questions. How decisive was the Battle of Midway, given the fact that the United States had such a dramatic industrial superiority? This graphical learning tool helped us visualize the rapid buildup of U.S. carrier forces after mid-1943, and it also helped us identify the critical gap where there was more of a balance in carrier forces. So if the Battle of Midway was decisive, and we believe it was, it's not because it was some crushing and definitive defeat of the Japanese Navy as it's often portrayed. Instead, it could more accurately be compared to a spoiling attack that disrupted or delayed the Japanese progress during that critical year to allow time for U.S. industry to build momentum. And to summarize some of our earlier points, had the United States lost the Battle of Midway, two of the immediate negative outcomes would have been a significant change to the course of events in the Guadalcanal campaign and other land campaigns, and also the potential that the Japanese would be able to continue their advance to a point where they could defend more effectively. We'll discuss those topics and other topics in more detail as we move forward in the course. Now, in the beginning of this video, we mentioned that this is not just an interesting topic, but it's also an important topic for military professionals and scholars. So why is that? Why is it worth our while to analyze and discuss whether or not the Battle of Midway was decisive? It's useful to know which factors are decisive in a conflict because that helps us make decisions in future conflicts. The Japanese decisive victory at Tsushima in the Russo-Japanese War created a bias that would persist into World War II, where they thought the way to achieve decisive victory was to win one large decisive battle. Ultimately, that didn't necessarily prove to be the case. So if you misidentify the decisive factors in a past conflict, you will be less able to identify the decisive factors in a current conflict. That's why it's useful to examine these types of questions. We hope you found this short video useful, and thank you for watching.